This is Jude and Revelation Part 1, the introduction. But we're going to start with Jude today. And Linda, you maybe not as familiar. We typically have different categories. I sort of fill in the blanks, and then but Jude is an interesting book. As you know, and we talked about it, and we looked at First and Second Peter, that it has a lot of overlap with Second Peter, and is thought actually to be the source of Second Peter. And I'll draw up that comparison shortly. Interestingly enough, it's one of the shortest books in the Bible, 25 verses, and it is the interesting authorship controversy. Jude it identifies itself as being written by this fellow named Jude, and it just says Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and the brother of James. And these are really the only two clues that we have about who the author might have been. The name Jude is listed outside of other occurrences like Judah or Judas. The name Jude is mentioned 5 times in the New Testament, 3 as in relationship to being Jude the apostle, who was someone who Christ appointed, and twice as being the brother of Jesus Christ. And there's a whole section of this that we're not going, or the whole controversy around this, we're not going to go too deeply into other than scratching the surface. But really what lies behind it is Jude, along with James, presents a challenge to Roman theology or Roman Catholic theology, because they hold that Mary did not have any other children. So, and in order for Jude or James to be the brother of the actual half brother of Jesus, because I guess, man, could you imagine being the step brother of Jesus or the half brother of Jesus? How cool that would be. But the half brother of Jesus, in the sense that after Mary had Jesus, she went on and had children, which Protestant theology would say that's fine. We're good with that. She was used in the way she was. God, incarnated Christ through Mary, and then Mary and Joseph found a normal marriage where they had other children, and Jesus had some brothers and sisters, who knows? But the mention of brothers, and James being particularly a brother, mentioning a brother. And so really it's kind of this weird, what does brother of James, what does brother of Jesus mean? And in the Filipino tradition, everyone is my cousin. If you were Filipino, they would say, oh, we're cousins. And there's a sense, in particular, in first and second generation Filipinos in the US, the term cousin is used for just familiar connections. I say my cousin lives in Colorado Springs. He's not actually he's like my third cousin once removed, sort of thing. So the question becomes is what is the relationship of this Jude character to Jesus? And it plays a role in part in terms of its decision to whether or not it should be canonized and whether we look at it. But the thought is this, is that if it was Jude if it was Jesus's brother, then it, hold on to that thought, because we'll get into that, and I want to talk about the canonicity of it in terms of how they determine that. But dating is probably before the end of the 1st century, sometime between 50 and 100. And this is the challenge. I don't know if you remember when we talked about the 1st and 2nd Peter, there were some challenges to the dates then of whether they fell prior to sort of the fall of Jerusalem, or fall or after, or whether it was written. And again, if 2nd Peter was a elaboration of Jude, then Jude could have been written really sort of prior to Nero's persecution, but in general, or the fall of Jerusalem in general. But we don't know. The bottom line is we don't have any idea when it was written. So it was probably written before 100, just in terms of some of the themes and things that it's dealing with. The audience is thought to be actually Jewish Christians. And I know many of the books of the New Testament are written more towards Gentile Christians, but the writing has particular Jewish features, which will lend itself to be toward the argument that that some of the basic features of Jewish literature eked through, perhaps as Jude was. If Jude was the brother of Jesus, he wouldn't have been a very educated person. He wouldn't have necessarily known beyond basics of writing and maybe some basic reading. But Jesus was raised in an Aramaic speaking home. And so even to be able to construct a book as short as Jude in Greek would, for some, is a little bit of a far-fetched sort of thing. Jude has reasonably good Greek and the common version of Greek. So if Jude, the apostle, wrote it, that's much more likely in terms of maybe being educated and having the same education. But Jesus, the brother, or Jude, if he was actually Jesus' brother, would not have been versed in Greek enough that probably would have been able to compose this, unless he picked up some Greek and was just an astute student along the way. If it was in fact Jude, Jesus's brother, then this probably would have been written in a Palestinian Christian community, and if it would have been written much earlier, and possibly dated as one of the earliest Christian New Testament writings. The context is also ambiguous. There is not really like who is it being written to exactly. It is uncertain. It just sort of typically has this theme of remaining faithful in the face, and in this case, the emphasis is on false teachings. He warns against scoffers and false teachers, and even those, and alludes to those who worship angels. And so it's kind of a warning. It's got a sort of a warning motif to it, and it has the effect of also assuring the reader that judgment will come upon these false teachers. And so there's some sense of saying, hey, don't trust them, be careful of them, but also realize that they're going to have their punishment in their own time. As I said before, it has tremendous similarities to 2 Peter. And the comparison is if you start after the introduction, the greeting, and it has that traditional epistle sort of introduction, greeting in 1 and 2, and then the conclusion, or what is deemed as a doxology in 24 to 25, and capping it out. But in between that, verse 3 relates to Peter 1:5, and if you if you want to find this comparison and look it up and put the two books next to one another, that's something that I started to do that and got about 3 verses in and realized that it's interesting, but it's not something that we need to necessarily go through, because it's pretty clear that one is informing the other, and the thought is that Jude informs 2 Peter. But verse 3 of Jude corresponds to 1:5 of Peter. Verse 4 corresponds to 1:12. Verse 5 to 2:10. Verse 6 to 2:4. Verse 7 to 2:6. 8 and 9 to 2:10 and 11. And it carries on and goes all the way down to verse 25, being from 3:18. And so there are these just sort of direct parallels to the verses in 2 Peter that are in a chronological sequence. And it's not as if they're taking a verse later in Jude and saying, oh, well, there's this one part, this sort of sounds like this. They're taking them, and if you look them in parallel, other than a few verses in between that you find in 2 Peter, you have almost Jude. You have the vast majority of Jude represented in 2 Peter.
So was he copying?
The thought is that if, well, we talked about 2 Peter being contested in terms of its authorship as actually being a Peter. Chances are they would have, but because it's a similar theme and it may have been written in a similar time, it could have been something that was passed on. If it again, one of the reasons that they do attach Jude to being Jude the apostle is they're looking for the apostolic authority, saying this is an important book. But it would have been the case where it would have come along and maybe someone representing or a Petrine sort of community or representation or a pseudonym sort of thing would have taken the basis of this, looking at it as good. This is good writing. This is considered not eloquent Greek, but well-versed Greek. someone who wrote this is not an unfamiliar student to the language of Greek. So it could have just been kind of like Mark is the source for Matthew and Luke. This is the source for Second Peter, and almost in direct comparison.
So that wouldn't have been considered plagiarism. I mean, if someone did that today, you'd get in trouble.
No, and in fact, a good thing to keep in mind is that even in our Western understandings of plagiarism today. So when I was a PhD student, I taught and had to grade and actually TA'd a lot of master's level students who I don't know if you know how the system works in doctoral studies, but professors don't read very many papers. Their TAs do. Yeah. That's how they read so many papers. But the amount of plagiarism that was present in Asian students' papers was astronomical. In particular, not American students who were raised here Asian, but Asian students who were international students who came over to the seminary, and they would plagiarize so much and they wouldn't even cite where it came from. And in the U.S. system or the English, the Western system, we just say just cite where you're plagiarized. Cite it, and it's not plagiarism. Say where you got it from. It's not a big deal. But to use another's work and to incorporate that explicitly so that it is notable that it's so quote unquote plagiarism is a part of in some Asian traditions honoring the voices that's how you honor the voices that came. So they would plagiarize chunks of writings from other authors, and we'd say you can't do this, and they wouldn't understand why. So the use of that sort of thing was throughout history, and I would say to the present day, and still in some cultures today, plagiarism, the idea of intellectual uniqueness or integrity or having something intellectual property of an idea of yourself is something that really has only come about in the last few centuries. Prior to that, most thought was considered shared or collaborative, uniquely so. But I don't know why I went off on that, but it's an important part of the hermeneutic in terms of understanding the usage of that. So some of the unique features of the book is that one, I thought this was really interesting. It has similar sentences and phraseology to James. And we know that there were some issues around James, and there's questions whether James was James the apostle or James the brother of Jesus, same sort of problem. But I think that if this was in fact Jude, the brother of Jesus, and it was James, the brother of Jesus, writing, you also have a point of connection there. I don't know if that's there. I'm just naming it as it is. It is also a point of contention for people that there is no direct reference to saying I am the brother of Jesus. And I think we talked about this before in relationship to James. At that time, using a related a relative or a familiar sort of designation saying, hey, I'm the brother of, would have been unthinkable. And in some sense, would have been challenging in terms of, they would have said, I'm James, the son of Zebedee, not, in other words, like you would have associated yourself with your father, not with who you were and your brother. And it could have also been viewed as a claim towards, I'm Jude, the brother of Jesus, so automatic authority. But again, we got to remember when they wrote these things, they weren't necessarily thinking they were writing something tantamount to an Old Testament canonized scripture. When Jews had this idea of the Old Testament and the holiness of those scriptures, as they were writing these letters, they weren't thinking someday they're going to make this part of the Bible, so I better make sure I get it right. They're just writing and doing their thing. And as a result of it, we consider them sacred texts. And again, that sense of authority or uniqueness of it, or even spirit dictated, that the idea that God dictated these to the original authors is not something that they would have considered at the time. Verse 4 refers to a false teacher. And this is one of the interesting characters. I just turn my page and missed the whole thing. Verse 4 says, after he says who he's writing to, says, for certain intruders have stolen in among you. So there's the idea is that there was some sort of false teacher within the community. People who long ago were designated for this condemnation as ungodly, who pervert the grace of our God into licentiousness and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. Now, because this is referring to intruders who have stolen among you, and it gives it a very personal tone. In other words, Jude wasn't writing as a circulating letter. He was writing to a specific community addressing a specific problem. And that's an important part to remember, because letters, not that we can't learn things from them generally, but letters written to a specific community should always be viewed in context of that specific community, because that's the intention of who it was written for. What else? I already said that. I guess this is interestingly enough, and one of the challenges it's had around canonicity has been the fact that it includes a number of quotes from the Old Testament, or from the Testament, from actually number of books, but some debated books. Testament of Moses. Verse 9 has a comparison or a relationship to a non-canonical book called the Testament of Moses, and it refers several times to the book of Enoch. And the book of Enoch was considered, again, part of the canon until the Reformation, but and then when they tossed it out with the rest of the Apocrypha, it created some challenges. It does not claim, one of the reasons that it's thought to have been, here's the thing, is if it was Jude the apostle, it has more apostolic authority than if it was Jesus' brother. It does not claim to have apostolic connection, and it actually refers within it to the apostles almost as another, which is one of the arguments for the fact that it was Jesus's brother, because he did not understand himself as an apostle, a disciple, yes, a disciple of Christ, but not as a named apostle. So the idea is that that if it was written again early by Jesus's brother, didn't claim apostleship, didn't claim, but at the time maybe didn't want to claim the fact that he was Jesus' brother because of the cultural connotations at the time, lends itself to the idea that he was writing, if it was Jesus' brother, he was writing to a church to address a community, still as a Christian leader, but not necessarily as an apostle. Those who argue that it must have been later by the apostle Jude argue that that James or Jude, the brother of Jesus, would not have been literate. He was Aramaic speaking. The form and structure are too sophisticated for Jesus's brother to a non-literate, unless if there is that he got trained somewhere along the way. But we don't know. And that really comes down to that idea of the relationship of the brother, which teases us into the argument of the perpetual virginity of Mary. Was it written with exclusively, if Jesus had a brother, and so Roman Catholics want to say, no, this was Jude the apostle because Jesus didn't have a brother. And so you have this division between Protestants and Catholics and how we view this. I did not look up to see what Orthodox believe, but Orthodox generally don't hold that same perspective. So they might, I don't know what they believe in relationship to that. But if the perpetual virginity of Mary is important to your doctrine of who Christ was and who Mary was, then you can see then it lends itself to a later writing. It lends itself to an apostle, or just being pseudonymous. At some point, they took some of these writings and they wrote them and they attached it to someone they thought would be, and it could have been something that was teaching. Yeah, Jim. I don't know, I called you James. That was weird.
Why is it such a big deal in the Catholic Church? In fact, I've never even heard of it until
the perpetual virginity of Mary.
Yeah.
Well, even more so, the Immaculate Conception, the sinlessness of Mary, like the perpetual nature of Mary. I understand why. I don't know. Actually, and to be honest with you, Jim, I've asked Shannon that too, and it's one of those projects that, in terms of my own studies, that I would like to explore. Why is it so important? And my guess is maybe for the average Catholic, it's not.
I think it is.
But for somewhere in Catholic theology, the idea of Mary's perpetual virginity and Mary's sinless. So you have two doctrines there: Mary's sinlessness, that's the Immaculate
Well,
Conception.
yes, that's true. I've heard that.
Which is a farther stretch for me. I struggle more with that because that's just sort of random. But you know, the idea that Joseph and Mary never had sexual relations isn't, I mean, you know, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. You know, if my wife just gave birth to the Son of God, I might, you know, want to refrain from I mean, like, you know, if you put it into the majesty of what it was, there could have been a fear. I mean, I don't know, you know, I mean, we don't know. All we know is that the reason we assume that Jesus had brothers and that there was sexual relations between Mary and Joseph after is because of the mention that he had a brother.
Yeah.
That's
Do
it.
you know when the Catholic
Linda's
Church?
out of here. Linda,
No,
we're not
I
even
said-
at Revelation. Linda, don't go.
He's gonna
Yeah, do
scream.
you know when the Catholic Church brought in that doctrine? Was it
I
at the
don't.
time of Dante?
You know, I don't know, but I do know that Mariology is pretty significant to Catholic spirituality. And so my guess is what I want to know, and I understand the doctrines, why they came about is what I don't understand. And again, I'm not
Based on just the Magnificat, all generations will call me blessed. When Mary, you know, when the angel came to her, and then she made that statement, and they just kind of built that whole doctrine on what she said in that one statement.
Yeah. Well, and there's truth in that and we don't know why that would have been important in the 1600s. You know, I mean, they say that most worship, you can take modern day worship and trace it back to the last time it evolved. So Orthodox worship you can trace back to about the 11th century. Catholic worship you can trace back with the exception of Vatican II. You can trace back, which was a revolution, but then we've recanted some of that and went back as Catholics have stepped back from that. But Roman Catholic theology and worship was largely solidified in the 1600s. Same thing with much of Protestant, Lutheran, any of the major sort of categories. If you look back, you can sort of see a couple hundred year period of nuancing, but really our worship goes back to the 1700s.
Did they always pray to Mary? Because, you know, there's, what do they call that prayer? Holy Mary, Mother of God.
Yes.
Pray.
The Hail Mary.
Or, yeah, the Hail Mary. Was that always part of the church?
Again, I don't know. That's where I have to admit that I don't know much about, I know the basics of Catholic theology, how they evolved, I do not know.
Yeah.
So, but I'm going to find out sometime in the next few years, because that's one of the things that I've sort of been curious about too. It's like that note in my mind that says this doesn't make sense to me, and I need it to make sense. At least I don't have to agree with it. I just have to understand how it came about. But okay, a couple more things on it. The structure is basically 1 to 2 is a greeting, 3 to 4 is a warning, 5 to 16 is sort of examples of sinfulness. 17 through 23 is a sort of encouragement or exhortation for believers, and it closes with the last 2 verses. The big theological stuff that comes out of it is a condemnation of the worship of angels and some of our angelology, which I know some of you have asked about. We'll maybe dig around that in the next 2 years. What does it mean? What is the whole angel conversation about? It has a lot of connections to Colossians, which also condemns angel worship. And so there is some thought that they are connected in content as well. Faithfulness in the end times. And again, if it was written during Nero's reign and they were being persecuted, that would have felt like the end times. And so that faithfulness theme comes in. It has a strong message that the evildoers will be judged by God, which would have been an encouragement to them that those who are persecuting them will be punished, and God will take care of them in the end. And strange enough, it addresses those who oppose Christian leadership, or oppose authority. And the challenge that it kind of presents is that it doesn't give enough information, whether it's Christian authority, whether it's Roman authority, whether it's God type, divine authority. It's just sort of a general authority. So it leaves some room for that. And I guess here at the bottom of the page, I wrote there's some notes about the canonization. It was largely disputed to be canonized until the end of the 2nd century, and then it was accepted. And it was formally accepted. It was generally accepted in the end of the 2nd century, but at the end of the 4th century in 397 at the Council of Carthage, it was included in the list of canonical books. And that's the first written record that we have that it was. See, again, you got to keep in mind, 400 years after Christ, 350, 400 years after Christ, a book is finally being accepted as being part of Scripture. And I say that because Christianity was spread throughout the whole region, and there were letters floating around. And so really from like 200s to about 400s, you have the gathering, because it was like all of a sudden, once Constantine said Christianity was legal, then all of a sudden it was okay to start gathering documents and to start figuring these things out and gathering together and finding some unity in thought. And yet it's still in the late 390s, Jerome, one of the early church fathers, rejected it, in large part because he didn't trust the book of Enoch, and relied on too many quotes in Enoch, and felt like it needed to be disqualified. Today, we as Protestants accept it as being part of our canon. It's useful for teaching. We don't really recognize whether it was Jude the apostle or Jude the brother of Jesus. In general, people, and it's far and wide. If you start looking at just sort of general commentaries and people's thoughts, people just sort of claim one or the other. And I think that really, when you dig down into the scholarship, there isn't consensus. So that's what I got for Jude.
It's a beautiful doxology at the
It
end.
is. Yeah, and you know what? I'll go ahead and read. I'm glad you mentioned that, George, because one commentator that I read said it was probably the best doxology in the New Testament. So it says this: "Now to him who is able to keep you from falling and to make you stand without blemish in the presence of his glory with rejoicing, to the only God, our Savior, through Jesus Christ our Lord, be glory, majesty, power, and authority before all time, and now and forever. Amen."
Harold Parker, our pastor for 20 years, he used that almost all the time at the end of the service.
As the benediction?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, really? The whole thing, exactly word for word?
Yeah, the whole thing. Yeah. But he'd, hold his hand up and
Like I do,
bless
but
us with that doxology.
yeah, nice. All right. You ready?
Let's do it.
Let me turn my pages. So we're not going to get too deep into the interpretation, just so I just want to make that clear again. We're not getting the, and I don't know if you can see my page. I usually take 2 pages of notes per book. So that was Jude. This is Revelation. And I don't know if you can tell the amount of scribbling I have in there is ridiculous. So I'll see, I may be looking down more, reading my notes, trying to figure all of it out, because even in trying to categorize this as I could. Okay, the book of Revelation. I just want to start from the very beginning to say that I really, as much as I joke about it, I think the book does have a place in the canon. I think the biggest problem is that people have looked at it and they've interpreted it with a lens that has made it complicated for everyone. And as I was sort of just reading generally about it and really thinking about it in relationship with the context of who John would have been writing to and where they were in, and in particular, as we'll talk about in a minute, the type of literature that it is, that the biggest error in understanding this book is us reading too much into it. And rather than looking at it as a sacred document that really fulfilled a need in the category of the world and the time and space that it came about, and rather than trying to have a literal interpretation of saying, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? And almost like it's a code to break. And we'll talk about this in a minute in more detail, but we often view Revelation as like it's this hidden book. And we look at these numbers and it's like this Da Vinci Code puzzle we're trying to solve. And if we can just solve it, then we'll have some knowledge about what will happen. And I think that hubris that somehow we can crack this book that was written, in the first century for churches in Asia Minor by one of their Christian leaders, in a style and literature that was written that characterized the times, and to try to make a modern parallel for that is dangerous and somewhat irresponsible. So as much as I was raised in a tradition that tried to name what these things were, I think that we really ought to treat this book with both reverence, but also with some fear and trembling that we do not have the context or understanding really to understand what is being said. And maybe in the end, it will all make sense. But you know what I always think in the end, if we're before God, we're not going to care. I will not have questions about Revelation in the new heaven and the new earth. I can promise you that. I'll be like, hey, God, there's that verse in Revelation where the 7-headed beast comes out. Can you just, that's not happening. It is considered the only, it's the last book of the Bible. I think it's worth saying, and it's the last book of the New Testament. It is the only apocalyptic book in the New Testament, although there are other books that have apocalyptic themes or motifs about them. This is the only truly apocalyptic book. And I'll get into in a second what that actually implies about apocalyptic literature. It is named after the first word in the Greek version of it, apocalypsis, which is in Greek. It deals and literally means the unveiling or the revealing of that which is concealed. And hold that notion of unveiling and revealing that which is concealed, because it will make more sense when we talk about what apocalyptic literature is and how it functioned at that time. This Revelation deals with a category of theology called eschatology, and that just means end times. And again, eschatology is a part of this apocalyptic literature. And before we get any further, before we get into it, I just want you to think about it. And I don't know how much you all watch Netflix or whatever streaming services, or how much you go to the films or the movies. But if you look back really at the last 2 decades of our culture, in particular over the last decade, and I want to even say the last 10, sort of 5 years, the amount of dystopian, apocalyptic, end times genres and movies that have come out and about, dramatically affect our thinking and understanding of what the apocalypse is. Now, saying that does not mean that our understanding of an apocalyptic sort of environment is a parallel for how John was writing or how the listeners would have heard this. And that's an important thing to understand when you're looking at Revelation, that our context and our relationship to the idea of apocalypse was not necessarily theirs. And literature and things in certain times relate to the context they come in. So, for example, in apocalyptic literature, it tends to be a revelation of explaining something about the cosmic universe. So it's like when someone has this transcendent apocalyptic encounter, or find themselves in an apocalyptic environment, and something is revealed in that, then it's revealing about something about the way the world is. So think about sci-fi novels, sort of the aliens come to invade. And it's an apocalyptic movie because it's the end of human existence as we know it. Well, what it's doing is explaining something more about the cosmos than it did. We're revealing some apocalyptic literature is meant to reveal something about the world that we did not understand. It is also meant to foretell something that is going to happen. So you got to keep in mind that when we think of sci-fi stuff, when we think of apocalyptic stuff, does it fall into the category of explaining something about the world, or suggesting something about the future and the way it's going to happen? And I want to say that typically it does. All right, we'll get into that a little bit more in the weeds in a second. But authorship, it's thought that it's John. It says John, and there are 2 self-references. One is John. And we don't know whether that's John the Apostle, John, some other, I guess there are a number of Johns, but John he refers to himself as Jesus, or as a brother, not as Jesus' brother. It distinguishes in 21:14. And I'm not going to look up some of these verses just given the time, but he distinguishes himself from the disciples or from the apostles. So it's thought that it maybe wasn't John the apostle. And in fact, the majority of scholarship right now would look at the John writing Revelation as not as the John who wrote the gospel. That doesn't mean that he doesn't come from a Johannine community. It doesn't mean he wasn't influenced by John, the writer of the gospel. But the thought is that this John was a Christian prophet at the time that it was written, probably around the end of the 1st century. And you can find verse when not only when he says, John, your brother, who share with you in Jesus the persecution of the kingdom and the patient endurance, was on an island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony. So the idea is that he was banished there. He couldn't preach the word there. He was being persecuted, so he escaped to the island. Also in, where is it? Just turn the page. 1:3, it says, blessing to the one who reads aloud the words of the prophecy. So he comes in as a prophet. The blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written, for this time is near. And then it names, basically the idea is that it's some John who's a prophet. Now, what I thought was interesting about that is even I, in my sort of just casual thinking, thought, you know what? Oh yeah, John. And I knew that there was some question about the epistles of John, whether they were actually John the apostle. But I always in my head somewhere assumed that John the apostle writing the gospel and John the of Revelation were the same. But apparently the majority of scholarship says that they don't think, for a number of reasons, they don't think, not that there was a common influence, but that it wasn't written by John the apostle. The dating is around written from the island of Patmos, which is 60 miles southwest of Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey. And because of the vocabulary and the writing style are very different from the Gospel of John, the idea is probably that it was written not as the same person, by the same person. It's dated somewhere between 81 and 95, which would put it after Nero, and it would put it during Domitian's reign. Sort of the last Domitian persecuted Christians till 96. It's thought that the mention of the 7-headed monster and the numbers 666 and these things were actually referring to Nero. And that their thought is that Nero was some sort of supernatural being and he would come back, because Nero represents the first the first persecution of Christians during the 1st century. Yeah, Jim.
Why did they stop the persecution?
They didn't.
Stopped in 97.
Well, official sanctioned persecution. So there's 3 levels of there are multiple levels of persecution. When Nero made Christianity legal or illegal, or sorry, then there was persecution, and people went underground. That doesn't mean that you have a sanctioned official persecution where they're seeking out Christians, and so you have sort of cultural persecution where you're hidden. You have overt persecution, and then you also have customs or cultural or societal persecution where they were just looked upon badly. And the problem with the challenge of any of these books that talk about persecution and suffering is that they don't identify often which one, and it would really depend on the dating. So during Nero's reign, if you were a Jew, you would have gotten out of town, or a Jewish Christian, you would have gotten out of town. Then remember that persecution was not necessarily, there was of Jews, and if you're a Jewish Christian, you're still ethnically a Jew, so the persecution applied. Domitian's reign would have been a more overt official persecution of Christians, and that would have been through up to 96. I don't know exactly what the dates of his persecution were. And Linda, I'm sorry, there's probably a lot of information that makes sense to everyone else, but not to you, because we've been talking about all this stuff as it's gone on. The audience is very clear. It says in verse 4, John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia. And you'll find throughout the book of Revelation and in apocalyptic literature that numbers play a major role. And for John, the thought is that there's the expression that John feels like the number of 7 is perfect. And it's because of the created day and the day of rest in creation made that the 7th day, sort of the number 7, perfect in that regard. But it's written to the 7 churches on mainland Asia Minor, and he was on an island. It states that the audience, that the churches and the Christians there were suffering. In 1:9, you see that I, John, your brother, who share with you in Jesus Christ the persecution in the kingdom and the patient endurance. So he's writing to those who are persecuted. And he's writing to those who are possibly expecting arrest. You see that in 2:10. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Beware, the devil's about to throw some of you in prison and be tested. And so there's a sense that whatever was going on in these 7 cities, in these 7 churches, that there was some fear. And then in 2:13, you have, I know that where you are living, where Satan's throne is, yet you are holding fast my name in my name, and you did not deny your faith even to me in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you. So they were being killed. And so, and there was some sense that they were suffering at the hands of persecution, but we don't know what level. If it was written by someone after the turn of the century, it could have been beyond a time of persecution. It could have been more social. If it was written earlier by the actual Apostle John, before, maybe during the time of Nero, around the time of the destruction of the temple, probably not. Probably after that, there could have been there would have been some sense of persecution. If it was written to the time of Domitian, it would have been a genuine sense of that there were government officials seeking you out and imprisoning you or punishing you for your faith in Christ. And then the other part about it is that it really, the book as a whole, or the audience, is that it's addressing complacent Christians about living in that time. And I think that this is an important fact, because when you look at it, when you look at the whole book as a warning, and you think about the audience that John was writing to, if they were suffering, and he's writing about end time suffering, and if there were those in the community, and there are lots of little verses, and we'll dig into some of those maybe next week, where it's basically there were Christians who were saying, at these end times, we're not living as a distinct Christian community. We're living within what is modern day Babylon. We're living by the customs of the culture that we're in. And there was tension in the church to say, how ought we live our lives as modern day Christians, or as, early church Christians, I guess at the time, not modern day for us, but at that time, that present day Christians in that end of the 1st century. And they were wrestling with how much they acclimated their lives to the culture at the time. Now, I think this has tremendous relevance for us today, because I think in the Western world, we have acclimated our Christianity to the Western context, or the Western culture as a whole. And so I think there's something worthwhile noting in all of this, and John's writing to these churches of warnings against mingling too much within culture. And so you get this sort of sense of what is the pressure between living as a part of culture and living as a distinct, marginalized community of faith. Was that?
Bumbling.
Okay. The context, as in general, the book is written in a style of Greek that one, actually more than one, a couple of folks say indicate that there was a Palestinian, that the writer was a Palestinian Christian immigrant. And just meaning he was not from Jerusalem. He was outside, and the west and the eastern part of where Jerusalem is. He would have been part of that Palestinian Christian growth there right after in the 1st century. It's thought that this is a writing as an apocalyptic response. I wrote down to persecution of Christians in Asia Minor, and I wrote down official. So meaning that there was an official persecution going on, and hence the imprisonment and the death. And this was an apocalyptic response. And I can hold that word apocalyptic in tension, because we're going to come back to that in a minute and sort of unpack that a little bit. And the question became, is how are we living in the world how we're supposed to, or are we living in the world as we will live in the new heaven and the new earth? How do we live in Babylon as the Babylonians, or should we be living out the kingdom of God and the virtues and the values that extend from that? And quite frankly, that's a question I ask for our church. What does it mean to be in our little town in the mountains? Are we just living according to a cultural Christianity where we all go to church on Sunday and we get our spiritual fill and just sort of have good Christian relations and we're all good people and that's good enough? Or ought we be living more of an intentional Christian life together? living as if we were living in that new heaven and that new earth. And that's a tension that I find myself in my own vocation now, is like, what, I don't want to live just as a Western imagined modern day theologian who can, pastor a little church in the mountains. I'd like to see us as a community really embrace that idea of what does it mean for us to live as if we lived in the new heaven and the new earth. And I think we have an idyllic setting to do that. It has the book as a whole, and this is something that I really found interesting. The book as a whole has lots of Old Testament references, but very few quotes from the Old Testament. So lots of Old Testament references and imagery, in particular drawing from Daniel. In fact, most of the biblical references drawn in the book of Revelation are from Daniel. And Daniel is an apocalyptic book, one of the few in the Old Testament that is purely labeled apocalyptic. It also takes most influenced by Ezekiel, which falls into some of those trippy sort of things as well. Psalms, which we know, and sometimes in Psalm you have different imagery that comes, the behemoth and dragons and other imagery that comes out of that. And Isaiah talks a lot about imagery as well, but related often to the impending doom of the invasion of Babylon and the Assyrians and that sort of thing. So there are scriptural allusions, but not necessarily references. Some of the unique features about this, and then and we'll go down and through this, and then I'm going to give you, and we're going to talk about apocalyptic literature. It is considered a pastoral letter. In 1:4-5 and in 20-21, it has traditional pastoral openings and closings like Paul's writings. So it is considered a letter. It's considered a letter that he wrote to these churches when he was on the island, and pretty clearly had lots to do. I wrote down Christian tradition in general attributes Revelation to the Apostle John, but although that has been contested over the years, but generally people would say that it is John. It actually has a unique take on martyrdom and the idea that you're going to die and the possibility of death. It probably embraces the inevitability of death more than other books, with the promise of Christ's return as well. 2:10 and 6, 9, and 11 are two examples of that, just as the idea that we are going to die and the persecution that we're facing may very well lead to death. It was one of the last books that was accepted as part of the canon. And some still reject it today. And in fact, the Eastern Orthodox Church, there was large distrust over the book until about the 15th century. And then in the Catholic Church, they doubled down on it. The Protestant Church has mixed feelings, and the Orthodox Church completely rejected it, to the point that it is the only book in the New Testament not in the divine liturgy of the Orthodox Church. So the earliest branches of Christianity, or the Orthodox Church, for the first 1,000 years, if you want to go back to like hardcore old Christianity, that's the Orthodox Church. They don't accept Revelation as being part of the canon. In the same Zwingli, who represents Swiss during the Reformation. You have three main reformers: Ulrich Zwingli representing the Swiss, the Lutherans represented by Martin Luther, or sorry, not the Lutherans, the Germans represented by Martin Luther, and the French Protestants represented by John Calvin. And so Calvin, Zwingli, and Luther are three main sort of reformers that we look back to the 16th century to understand how thought was reformed. Zwingli completely rejected it. Luther rejected it, but then he included it when he was listing the books of the canonical books, and so it might have just been him accepting of the authority. Luther tended to accept the authority of the Catholic Church more than the other reformers did. I remember a professor say once that where Luther tried to rearrange the pieces of the chessboard, that Calvin was like, I'm just clearing all the pieces and inventing and re-putting them back on the table. But Calvin, actually, it's the only book that John Calvin, our founding father, did not write a commentary on. So he chose, like me, he clearly wanted to avoid it. And maybe I guess where I get my sensibilities from. I get them from Calvin. It's considered an epistle, being that it's a letter. It's considered apocalyptic in that it describes sort of a revelation of our cosmos and what will happen in the time to come in end times. And in that way, it is also considered somewhat of a prophetic book as a whole. And here's the sort of last thing that I'll say before I get into sort of the flow of the book is its imagery, its form, its content, the way it's using these bizarre, strange things that we think are don't make any sense to us, made sense to the readers and the hearers of that day. Yeah, John or Jim. Sorry, man. I don't know. Too many J names floating around here. What's that, Jim?
Do you think he wrote it to scare the people into being good people? And
Yes.
okay, thanks.
I do. And honestly, what I just said to you, and I don't know if that triggered that thought, the imagery and form and content that we read, that we find so disorienting about this book, monsters and behemoths and numbers, and we're trying to break the code and we think God's giving us some secret message. Well, one, like the whole idea that God is trying to make things so secretive and challenging and we have to break some code to figure out some stuff. We don't know the day or the hour God's going to return. That's clear. Christ didn't even know the day or the hour God's going to return. So the idea that we have to crack some code to figure this book out is our own modern day need to understand, coupled with the fact that we've seen too many Da Vinci Code movies and things like that. And what I thought was really interesting about that was, let's say you jump ahead 1900 years and someone comes back in on unearths documents from the era that we're living in. And I love this example is, if you were to look at the sci-fi motifs of the way we write about things. So think about like Godzilla or world disasters or big tremors, the idea that there was a movie of these big earthworms coming out of the ground, or Dune, there's this big, or Star Wars, all of these, E.T. In other words, if you unearth documents 2,000 years from now from our present day, and you look at some of the literature that was written, and even if you interpret it, like, in other words, that all of those things, all of those narratives, the whole world of Star Wars, the whole world of Marvel, the whole world of the X-Men, the whole world of Star Trek, and some of these other cosmic realities that we've created are very familiar to us. Like if someone were to come out with another Star Wars or space sort of theme, it wouldn't really faze us much. We'd think, all right, that's just kind of in the vein of what sci-fi is, because we're used to the language of some of the things that we're dealing with in sci-fi, like the idea of monsters or the idea of transporting from a ship down to Earth, or these are concepts that we dabble in, so they're familiar to us in the same way that the concepts that are in Revelation would have been familiar to the hearers of that word.
Was it attempting to kind of create a Christian mythology kind of parallel to the Greek and Roman mythologies?
No, I mean, I think actually, if you look back at the Old Testament, even in the Hebrew literature, you have these images of these monsters. And in that day and age, these monsters represented things about so apocalyptic literature has typically three characteristics. One, it deals with the transcendent world. It deals with something of the divine, something out of our nominal world. It taps into the phenomenal world that is out there. So monsters have powers, and there's all this symbolic language. But the difference is when the hearers of the book, those 7 churches who would have been listening to this, they would have heard and seen these images, and they wouldn't have confused them. These are familiar motifs and images for the original hearers, is the kind of the sense is. They're weird for us because they don't represent the worldview that we are in. But for them, it would have been normal. So the idea of different numbers meaning things would have been something for them to be normal. There's all sorts of references in the Old Testament about 40, about 12, 7. There are these numbers that sort of play this major role in the thinking of the Jewish mind, and would have carried on into the extension of this new version of Christianity. Yeah, Donna.
Our battery's almost gone, so I'm afraid we'll have to leave, but
Well,
we'll see you next week.
okay. Well, we don't have much more to go. So if it dies out, that's okay. I'm just gonna.
We'll leave it on until it runs out.
Until it comes out.
Yeah, I don't want it to go all the way or I have trouble getting it back. Okay.
No, actually, it's good to let your battery die every now and then. It tells it where the end point is. But no, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that the symbolism that John uses in Revelation is not meant to be a code to break. And this is one of the major interpretation problems that we're facing is we see these, what is this image with 7 heads? What is this, what are these bowls? What are these trumpets? And we want to take things in our modern day time in the decade or century or time that we live in. We want to say, oh, this means this, and this means this. And we forget that this has already been 2,000 years old or 1,900 years old, and they're trying to figure out what these things are meaning. And maybe perhaps none of these things are meant to have a direct parallel to our present day time because they weren't written necessarily with an explicit thing, but more of the cosmic power. They're just common imagery that the Jewish and early Christian listeners or readers would have heard and understood because it was a part of their cultural worldview. So it's not a code to break. They're not metaphors that need to be unpacked and connected to direct things in a one-to-one comparison in our modern day. And that's one of the biggest problems of interpretation. It's meant to be wrestled with. What are these transcendent realities? And really that notion of, and the second thing about apocalyptic literature, it always presents good versus evil. And the imagery built into the good versus evil is a part of the characteristic of the literature. And again, it's not meant for us to interpret it as a literal one-on-one to make sense of it. It's meant to just sort of take it generally as these are forces that are not meant, because again, they were using metaphors that those at the time understood that we don't, that seem weird to us now because we don't traffic in that language on our everyday basis, or in our media, in our movies, we don't necessarily, and sometimes we could probably make some of those comparisons now. So there's a dualistic cosmology of good and evil. The forces of the world are good versus evil, bad versus good, all that sort of thing. And 3, there's an expectation of an end. And John does do that. And again, if this was written at the time of the end of the Domitian reign where they were being persecuted, John very might as well thought, John the prophet, John the author of this book, very might as well thought that this was the end times, truly the end times, like this was it. And so for him, the destruction, the doom, he's trying to get the churches in these 7 cities to stop trying to live like the world and to try to live like they are the virgins who are waiting for the bridegroom to come and receive them. And he's trying to shake them up. And yes, again, it's crazy literature for us, but for them, it wasn't as shocking of imagery. And I think that was one of the things for me in my research this week of it, as I thought, oh, I don't like it because I can't make sense of it, but maybe because I'm trying to make sense of it is the reason I don't like it. And I don't need to make sense of it. That's our own modern day need to try to connect everything together. The last thing I want to say for today, and I know we're out of time now, and we're going to pick up again next week on some of the larger motifs and interpretations. I just kind of want to walk you through the book as a whole. That'll take literally about 2 minutes, so just bear with me. It starts with John at Patmos, and in 1:1 to 3:21, he has a revelation of Jesus. So there is some sense of this is being revealed by Jesus. And again, maybe it was revealed by Jesus for the Christians of that day, but it makes sense to them. And then he comes into, he says names that there are 7 messages for the 7 cities or 7 letters, and that's in 4:1 through 11. And then you have this sort of esoteric idea or this transcendent idea that John is sort of transported to heaven and has these that's in 4:1 through 11. And then in that he sees Jesus, the Lamb of God, at the right hand of God. He opens his judgment book. That's 5:1 through 14, and has this first round of judgment. And then some trumpets appear in 6 through 11, and you have this succession of greater judgments that come out of that. And that there was again, the number 7 is there. And then he moves into these visions, and the rest of the book is really dabbles in these visions. And this is where people get caught up. 7 bowls of God's wrath in 12 through 16. The great evils of Babylon come through in 17 through 19. And and we're going to go through some of these visions next week and what they mean. But really, interestingly enough, we don't focus on those. We tend to focus on this final section of 19 through 22, where it deals with the final judgment and Jesus' return and a new Jerusalem and a new heaven and a new earth. And we tend to put all of our interpretation of what's going to happen in these last few chapters, and we ignore the entire context of the book, that it's dealing again with writing to these churches or trying to motivate them, and we interpret them in relationship, and we forget sometimes that John was writing in a time that he thought Jesus was about to return. So the sense of urgency, this sense of, and the persecution they were feeling, they were already feeling in the midst of it. They were coming out of, John is on this island writing this book because of persecution. And these churches that he is writing to, he's connected to, these Johannine communities that are in these 7 cities in Asia Minor, they were facing these persecutions and they were wrestling with the idea of the end time. And what he's trying to do is encourage them to live faithfully, to bring them around, to kind of paint a picture. But he does so in an accepted literary style of that day and age. We don't have that. We've turned the apocalyptic genre outside of the whatever, the Thief in the Night and the Present Darkness and some of these end times novels. We don't really treat, and even that's fictional to some extent. We treat apocalyptic end time eschatological stuff as being a part of literature. And then we try to somehow bring in spirituality and say, well, what about this? And this is how it makes sense. But for John, he didn't know we were going to live 2,000 more, 1,900 or more years. He thought it was happening in the moment. So the sense of urgency, the sense of imagery, which again, they were familiar with, it all sort of fits into this picture. If he's writing to a community some basic things to encourage them to stand strong, to not conform to the world, to recognize that there was a new heaven, that they should be new citizens of this new heaven and new earth. And he was using all of the imagery that they would have been acceptable to them and understood by them. Now, the problem is us in the modern day, we've lived 1,900 years, we're 1,900 years after this writing, and we're like, Jesus still hasn't come. We're 1,900 years of interpretation of Revelation, trying to figure out what it means. And if we take that out of the context it was written for, we miss some of the major intentions of the book. So I think there is something redeeming in the book in the sense that it was written for churches who were struggling in a time of persecution, and we'll draw that out next week. What it tells us about the end times has to be looked at in the view of John felt like that he was in the end times. Now, could God have used those proclamations for the future, for us, for the next 1,900 years? Absolutely. But does that mean that we should do that one-on-one comparison? If this means this, that's our own interpretation. And I'm sorry, the self-authenticating authority of my decision of what that decoding is where we get into problems, and why we have, over the last, in particular, about 50 years, faced so many issues around this book, and so much division in the church, and so much abuse around really even the proclamation of the gospel, with the sense of like we have to rein people in order, because we're facing these end times. And the truth is, it could be another 1,000 years before Christ returns. We don't know. All right, so that's where I'm going to end today. I hope that was somewhat helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks. Hey, it's great to
Thank
see
you,
you.
guys. Be safe.